We've already talked a bit about the importance of writing style in technical writing. We've contrasted academic writing style to technical writing style, and we've talked in general about the ways you might modify your style for different readers. Chapter 4 of your textbook offers a deeper, more specific look at the principles of style in technical writing, though. I'm going to cover a few of the important ideas from the chapter in this lecture, but I want to reiterate now that this lecture is not meant as a replacement for reading the textbook chapter. There are many important ideas in that chapter. I'm not going to cover all of them here, so you should definitely read the chapter fully before watching this lecture. The key point, as always in technical writing, is that you need to have a reader-centered approach to your style. In other words, your style should always be tailored to the needs of your specific audience. That means before you can determine the best type of style to use, you have to ask yourself some basic questions about the audience, and I should say these questions should be sounding pretty familiar to you by now. First, what does your audience already know? If you're writing to an audience that's highly familiar with the topic, you're going to use a different style than you would if you're writing to an audience with less specific knowledge. You might use jargon or other specialized terminology with a more knowledgeable audience, but you definitely would not want to do so with an audience of non-specialists. In some cases, even stylistic elements like sentence length and structure might change based on how much knowledge your audience has. Second, what kind of style does your audience expect? Often the company or organization that you work for will have a particular style that you'll be expected to follow for certain kinds of documents. In these cases, you don't have to make many decisions about style, you just have to follow the style sheet or previous examples as closely as possible. It's important to remember in general that personal style is not really a virtue in technical writing. You're usually not trying to write in your own individual voice when you write in a technical context. Instead, your style should conform as closely as possible to other examples of the genre. Remember, technical writing isn't about you. It's always about the task that you're trying to accomplish. Regardless of audience, though, there are some general stylistic guidelines to writing strong technical prose, and I think this is the real value of Chapter 4. The bulk of the chapter is built around 5 keys to building effective sentences. I really like the specificity of these guidelines and the way they direct your attention to the sentence level of your writing. And while these guidelines and strategies may not always be appropriate in an academic context, I think they're pretty universal in technical writing. The 5 keys are: watch your sentence length, keep subjects and verbs close together, avoid pompous language, avoid excessive use of is-are verbs, and use active voice wherever possible. Let's go over each of these principles a little more fully. First, when the book says that you should watch your sentence length, it's important to understand that they're not saying that one specific length of sentence is the right length. I don't think we can say that short sentences are right and long sentences are wrong, or vice versa. The real key here is to be aware of your sentence length and to try to manage it appropriately for your task and audience. In general, you probably want to favor shorter sentences when writing to an audience with a lower level of knowledge, but even then you probably want some variety in the length of your sentences. Except in specific cases, including, as we'll discuss, writing the steps of an instruction manual, you probably don't want your writing to consist only of a string of very short sentences in a row. Sentence variety helps keep the reader engaged and helps keep your writing from sounding monotonous. But you also definitely want to avoid excessively long sentences. The definition of excessively long does vary with your audience and task a bit, but the suggestion in the textbook that you consider trimming any sentence longer than 15 or 20 words is probably a good general principle. The second key, the idea that you should keep subjects and verbs close together, might require a little more explanation. And actually, that explanation will only be helpful if you're confident about identifying subjects and verbs in sentences. If you aren't, you should probably spend a little time on the internet researching basic English grammar. But if you have even a rudimentary understanding of English grammar, you should be able to at least recognize how putting more emphasis on the verbs in a sentence will make that sentence more active, and usually more clear as well. Look at this sentence, for example. In the case of employees who are exempt from weekly timesheets, such as those employees designated as contract labor, A separate form, filed directly with human resources, may be used. This is a sentence that makes the reader do a lot of work just to get to the verb, that is, just to get to the point of the sentence. Technically, the main verb in the sentence comes in the final phrase, may be used. The subject of the sentence, believe it or not, is a separate form, which is pretty far removed from the verb and pretty far back in the sentence. Maybe more importantly, that sentence and verb combination, a separate form may be used, tells the reader almost nothing about the idea being communicated in the sentence. The subject of a sentence is the thing that does the verb, the actor or agent that is engaged in some kind of activity. Obviously, the form isn't doing much in this sentence, which means that the sentence overall is not very active. Much better would be a sentence structure that identifies the real subject more clearly and more quickly, and pairs it with a more active verb. Something like this, in other words. Exempt and contract employees should file a separate form with human resources. Now, obviously, we've made multiple improvements to that sentence. It's shorter, it's written in the active voice rather than the passive voice, which we'll get to in a few minutes, and other things. But the key here is that we've put the emphasis much more firmly on the action in the sentence by placing the subject, employees, very close to the verb, should file, and by presenting those elements early in the sentence. Chapter 4 talks a lot about the verb-word ratio in a sentence, which is basically the idea that you want a relatively high proportion of words in the sentence to be verbs. I think that's an interesting tool to use to diagnose potential problems with sentences, but I don't think most technical writers think about their sentences quite so mathematically. As long as you keep the length of your sentences manageable and make sure that the main verb is emphasized by getting to it early in the sentence, you'll probably be okay. The third key is one I think we can all get behind. Avoid pompous language. The textbook adds a tag phrase to this key, write to express, not to impress. I actually think this is a good rule to use in all writing. I talk about this point in my freshman composition classes when we get to the idea of academic style. Some students have been led to believe that writing in an academic style means using big words and purposefully complicated sentence structure, and I work hard to disabuse them of that idea. There are times, of course, in both academic and technical contexts when you'll need to use some specialized vocabulary, and sometimes that means using big words. But I can't think of any writing situation in which you should consciously aim for pompous language. There's an old rule for writing, which comes actually from George Orwell, the guy that wrote the novel 1984. He also wrote a famous essay called Politics in the English Language, in which he gives the following piece of writing advice. Never use a long word where a short one will do. He wasn't talking specifically about technical writing, but certainly his rule applies to technical writing. The first goal of technical writing is always clarity, so it's important to always use plain, straightforward language wherever possible. In the professional world, readers won't be impressed by your use of unnecessarily big or obscure words, and impressing the reader isn't your goal anyway. Your goal is ensuring that the task is completed effectively. The best tool you can use to meet that goal is clear, simple language. There's a great chart near the end of Chapter 4 that presents types of words and phrases you should generally avoid and offers suggestions for better words to use in their place. I would strongly recommend reading over that chart and thinking about the words you use, certainly in your instruction manual project, but also in any technical writing you produce. The fourth and fifth keys, avoiding is-are verbs and using the active voice rather than the passive voice, are actually related to each other. And they're also related to one key we've already discussed about keeping subjects and verbs together. All three of these keys are really about keeping the focus of your sentences on actions. The problem with what the book calls is-are verbs, in other words, forms of the verb to be, is that even though they're verbs, they don't offer any action in the sentence. Is-are verbs make statements rather than portray action. There's a big difference between saying, there is a button you should push, and push the button. Obviously, you can't avoid is-are verbs completely. They're really important in the English language. But wherever you can, you should try to substitute more active verbs. One big problem with is-are verbs is that they often lead you into passive voice constructions. This is another place where a basic knowledge of English grammar would be helpful. I don't have time to go into detail about the passive voice, but basically it occurs anytime you take the natural object of the sentence and turn it into the subject. So in a sentence like, I read the book, the natural subject, sometimes called the agent, is I. After all, I'm the one doing something in the sentence, not the book. The book is the natural object in the sentence, since something is being done to it. But it's possible to invert that order and treat the natural object as the subject, leaving you with a sentence like, the book was read by me. We call writing this kind of sentence using the passive voice. The sentence is grammatically correct, but it obscures the agent of the sentence by moving it to the end. And it also makes the sentence less active, since it puts emphasis on the book, which isn't doing anything at all. English teachers often tell students to avoid the passive voice altogether in their writing, which is probably an overgeneralization. There are some contexts, some kinds of scientific lab reports, for example, where the passive voice is actually preferred, since it takes emphasis away from the individual conducting the lab. But in many contexts, the passive voice presents a real problem for your writing, not only because it's less active, but because it obscures responsibility. It's possible, for example, to take that sample sentence above and leave out the agent altogether and say something like, the book was read. Now, not only is the sentence passive, but you don't know who was doing the reading in the first place. This kind of writing can sometimes lead to ethical issues. Companies, and politicians especially, will sometimes say things like, mistakes were made, or incorrect information was posted. In both of those sentences, notice how the writer or speaker is admitting to a problem, but not quite taking responsibility for that problem. They don't say who made the mistake, or who posted the incorrect information, and that can present a big ethical problem. So you should try to avoid passive voice in general in technical writing, but you should absolutely never use it purposefully to try to obscure responsibility for actions. Hopefully by this point in the semester, you've learned how important it is to be careful and avoid errors when writing in the workplace. Also, hopefully Chapter 4 and this lecture have made you think about going beyond making your writing just correct, and have started you thinking about how you can manage the style of your sentences so that they're as effective as possible.